Well, good morning. Welcome to day 31 of the Whole50 Bible study for those of you who were here on time. And, well, technical difficulties sometimes happen. Today, we are looking at Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 through 22. So we're back in the Old Testament, which will make some of you perhaps excited and will make others of you perhaps not so excited. But either way, so glad that you have joined us for today as we jump back into the Bible, into a passage that is actually quite fascinating. It's one of the more interesting, to me, parts of the Israeli wilderness journey as they move out of Egypt from the 10 plagues and Pharaoh towards the promised land. Now, one thing before we get there, I want to remind you that we have this new Bible study starting on May 17th, and these are going to be put in the mail this week. So there's about a day or two left for you to make sure that you get yours. You can make sure to get yours by going to christtable.today, and all of our donors in April and May are going to receive one of these. And if you don't have the resources by which to donate, just let me know and I'll make sure that you get one anyway. Other thing that I want to remind you of is this weekend, if you're in South Florida, we're going to be here in Jupiter at Carlton Park. Again, looking forward to that. We are going to be at the same pavilion, the CEO's Pavilion. Would love to invite you to come and be a part of that. In fact, I just got a message this morning from something fun that I think is going to be a part of the event. And so looking forward to it. It's going to be Mother's Day. It will be 1 hour or less because we know that there are many festivities that some of you need to attend to for Mother's Day. For others of you, it's not something that you celebrate. So if that's all right, if that's the situation that you're in, go ahead, come and be a part of what's going on. The whole morning isn't going to be about Mother's Day. Obviously, we will say a prayer and thank the mothers who are there. But the morning, I don't think, I haven't looked at the text yet to see what falls on Sunday, but I don't think it's a passage about mothers. So if that's a tough day for you, you're still going to be safe. If you live outside of South Florida and closer to northeastern Ohio, then the following Sunday, it's hard to believe that it's less than 2 weeks. We're going to be up there. Daniels Park is the plan where we'll be on Sunday, May 16th at 11 o'clock a.m. Looking forward to being there in person with our northeastern Ohio partners. But today we have some Bible study to get to finally. So why don't we go ahead and jump in to Exodus chapter 13, verse 17 through 22. When Pharaoh finally let the people go, and if you've seen the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston or the Prince of Egypt, or even just read in the book of Exodus, you know that it took some time for Pharaoh to let the people go, obviously, because they were the workforce for Egypt that built all of even what we see today in Egypt. All of the great monuments and tombs and pyramids were built by the children of Israel, which is absolutely crazy. So when Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the promised land. God said if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. You can take the people out of Egypt, but it's so much harder to take Egypt out of the people. Even though they were slaves there, they had become comfortable. Stockholm syndrome. They had begun to identify with their captors after 500 years of slavery. Think about that. 500 years of slavery where they had been in the land of Egypt. And so once they got out into the wilderness where things were difficult, there was great concern that they would just simply go back to Egypt after everything that God and Moses had done in order to free them from their captivity. So instead, verse 18 says that God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Thus, the Israelites left Egypt like an army ready for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, whom 500 years earlier, Joseph had made his sons swear that they would do that because he said that God will certainly come to help you. Joseph did not want his people to remain and reside forever in Egypt. He knew that God had given them a promised land, the land of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. And so he was intent upon ensuring that he would not remain in Egypt when his people did not. And so God will certainly come to help you, Joseph had said. And when he does, you must take my bones with you from this place. It's hard to believe that 500 years later in antiquity, even before antiquity, they remembered where Joseph's bones were buried. And so he must have been buried in a very prominent, very visible, and very well-known location. And so they dug up his bones, probably had been mummified, and took them with them. The Israelites left Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. So now we're starting to get some map data here. And the Lord went ahead of them. He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud, and he provided light at night with a pillar of fire. This allowed them to travel by day or by night. And the Lord did not remove the pillar of cloud or the pillar of fire from its place in front of the people. So to me, I just love this image of God guiding his people. Moses could have guided the people and did, in a sense. Joshua, second in command, could have guided the people, but God himself chooses to guide the people, but chooses not just to guide the people through the words and the leadership of Moses, but chooses to guide the people himself through a cloud in the day and a pillar of fire at night. Why? Well, I'll leave that to you and leave that to conjecture as well. But I think that there are probably many reasons why God chose to do that. Perhaps foremost among them was they were in such a broken state, and Egypt had so infiltrated their hearts and their souls and their minds that God needed to miraculously prove to them over and again his presence and that he was guiding them. Now, I know that we mentioned in the beginning a little bit about the journey and the direction. I just thought that it might be helpful for just a moment to cover up my face and to put up this map. And so what we have here is a map of Egypt. Over on the left, it says Lower Egypt. You have Upper Egypt. You have Goshen there. And then in the middle, you have Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, the wilderness of Shur. And then over on the upper right of this map would be what would be considered the Promised Land. You barely see Jerusalem at the top of your screen. Perhaps you see Hebron, all of that area to the left, essentially, of the Dead Sea is the land of promise. And so they're coming from the left side and they're heading towards the right side. And you see at the very top, there's a black line that says the way of the land of the way to the land of the Philistines. Now it says specifically in the text that God did not take them this way because he did not want there to be war between them and the Philistines, where they might turn around and go back to Egypt. And so I think that's interesting because oftentimes we see God in the Old Testament, or we perceive God in the Old Testament as being a God who is vengeful, who is angry, who is constantly taking people to war and doing ethnic cleansings. And I'm not so sure that that is a truthful view to the Old Testament in the way that it's written. And this is one of those data points that indicates that even in the Old Testament is not the heart of God for there to be war. And he intentionally directs his people not to go the shortest route because of that. Now, a little below that, you see another one that's called the way to Shur. This is another path through the wilderness that isn't even mentioned in the text. Why is this path through the wilderness that is still a shorter route than the one that they took? Why is that one not mentioned? Well, this one is not mentioned because there just aren't enough wells, isn't enough water along the way to sustain the group of people that would be traveling. And so what we see in the red is the traditional route of the Exodus. Now, it's hard for us to know specifically the route that they went, but we know that they went a route that was circuitous. We know that they went a route that was out of the way, that was not the shortest route because the Bible tells us so. We know that they ended up at Mount Sinai, and they're down at the very bottom of the Sinai Peninsula. You'll see right under Rephidim, you'll see Mount Sinai listed. And so we know that they crossed the Red Sea. We know that they crossed the Gulf of crossed the Red Sea higher than the Gulf of Suez into the Sinai Peninsula, that they took a circuitous route around there, and essentially, as the story goes, they ended up spending 40 years in the wilderness. That travel plan that's intended for them, even though it does go around the Sinai Peninsula, the longest route, it wouldn't have taken 40 years to get around it. It would have taken months, multiple months, in order to move through that. But because of their failure to trust God over and again, they end up spending an entire generation in the wilderness. And so what can we retrieve? What can we get out of this passage? Well, I think a couple of things. First, we understand, and they understood, that they would face difficult challenges, hostile foes, and experiences of war, but that the wilderness years would be years of formation, of development, of maturing, and of learning. You see, God took them out of a place where they were comfortable, but where they were under oppression. Now, the difficulty with becoming comfortable with oppression is that sometimes whenever we become comfortable with the oppression that we're under, freedom feels like torment. Does that make sense? They were so comfortable living under slavery and had become so used to living under slavery that to them, in their minds, the land of promise, living in a place where they were free to follow God, felt like oppression. So their minds had become completely turned upside down from what would be sensible. It's almost this what's been called battered wife syndrome, which I hate that term, frankly, but for what it is, it's similar to kind of what happens here, where you identify so strongly with your captor that you begin to prefer captivity over freedom. And so they're going to face challenges and hostile foes and experiences of war. And if that's all that they see, then they're going to want to run back to Egypt. And oftentimes, whenever we're under oppression, all that we can see is what's bringing us pain. And the wilderness was going to bring them pain. God tried to save them from as much of it as he could by directing them in a direction that was around the Philistines, that would avoid as much war as possible. But at the end of the day, because they were on the move and moving forward, they were going to encounter barriers in some way, shape, or form. And sometimes, whenever we are oppressed, all that we can see are the barriers and the pain. It was super difficult for the Israelites to see, though, that during those wilderness years, they were also going to experience formation. They were going to experience development and strengthening. They were going to experience maturing. They were going to grow up, and that they were going to learn a lot. And unfortunately, they didn't recognize, or appreciate those lessons and the power and the benefits of the wilderness until much, much later, because all that they could see was the pain that they felt. They kept getting triggered by the pain along the way because it felt like Egypt. And why not just go back to Egypt, where they might be under slavery, but they didn't have to worry about whether or not they would eat or whether or not they would drink. Now, I think that we can take this mindset and we can transfer this mindset also onto our own lives. How many times in our own lives have we become so comfortable with the pain and oppression that we're living in that we end up choosing the pain from the oppressor rather than moving towards the promises that God has given to us? And yeah, there's going to be difficulty along that route. But oftentimes, what happens is the first difficulty that we encounter whenever we begin to follow God, we run back to Egypt and we run back to the comfort of our oppression. But then we miss the privilege of learning and forming our faith along the way, of developing and strengthening those spiritual muscles and those relational muscles and those psychological muscles. We don't mature. We don't grow up, and we don't learn anything. And so maybe this morning, if you're living in the comfortable oppression of Egypt, it's time to assess whether or not God is calling you to something greater, not necessarily something easier in the beginning, but something greater. There may be a wilderness, but maybe if you see that wilderness that you're about to enter into as being one where you're going to grow, rather than seeing the wilderness as simply something that's going to bring more pain, you'll understand that on the other side of that wilderness that you're facing, there's freedom. And where you're living right now in Egypt, there's not freedom. The other thing too, the pillars are a reminder to the Israelites that the presence of God is a constant presence. The God who had redeemed his people also promised to guide and protect his people, and he does. He guides and protects his people each and every step of the way, even when they continually, over and again, give him the middle finger with the way that they act and the way that they react to the situations in the wilderness. They continually decry God. They continually ask to go back to Egypt. They continually cause Moses so much trouble that Moses says, God, please kill me. I would rather die than continue to lead these people. And yet God still guides them, and God still protects them both day and night. And I think if you're feeling today as though God has abandoned you, maybe you felt as though God has abandoned you in your Egypt. Has he? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that he has. Maybe you're just missing the pillars during the day and the fire at night. Maybe you've stopped being able to see the great cloud in front of you leading you. But that doesn't mean that the great cloud isn't still there leading you and guiding you and protecting you. And I think that for those of us who are followers of God, the key word being the followers of God, that whenever we are truly following God and not simply standing still or not simply resigned to living in Egypt, that God is present and that his presence is constant with us both day and night. Whether or not you see it or whether or not you feel it, it's still there. And maybe that's the most important thing that we can be reminded of today as well, is that God is committed to guiding you. God is committed to protecting you as his follower. But also as a follower, we have some responsibility to follow and to not remain in Egypt. And it's not as though we have to enjoy the wilderness. But there are moments where we do have to endure it for our own good. But we can be assured that God is still protecting us from the way of the Philistines and the wars that come and the difficult foes, which leads me to believe that the difficulties which we face are ones that He knows that with His help and His guidance and His protection, we'll be able to see through. He's not going to take you through anything that's going to force you back to Egypt when you're following Him. He has your best in mind. And maybe for you today, that's the most important thing that you need to hear, because that pillar of cloud and that pillar of fire is still just as present today as it was then. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And He loves you, and He cares for you, and He's there for you. Don't stay in Egypt. It's time to finally grab a hold of those promises, pass through the wilderness, and get on to what's next. You can do it. Until tomorrow, happy reading.